Lesson 2, Tivoli Storage Manager Database and Log Space. Let's look at managing the database space. You provide empty directories or drives for TSM to let the database manager take care of managing the space. You're going to put your database on a very reliable disk that has enough room to grow and has a fairly fast read-write rate. The database size is determined by the amount of data you store. The maximum supported size is 4 terabytes. Your database minimum size is 2.2 gigs, maximum size 4 terabytes. Now if you're upgrading from version 5, know that that same database will take additional space with version 6. We're going to go through an exercise to estimate how large your database should be. Be sure to factor in file growth. Your active log minimum is 2 gigs. This is what we used in the lab because we were short of space. Maximum size 128 gigs. Default is 16. If you're using data deduplication, your log will be larger. For your archive log, make sure you have enough space so that you will have all the files from the previous full backup. Only a full backup clears your archive log. In Unit 10, when we talk about protecting the database, there's also incremental database backups and snapshot backups of the database, but they do not clear the archive log. The size of the database depends on the number of client files stored, the number of versions of your backups, and whether or not you're going to be using caching. You can also have additional overhead space. A rule of thumb that we're using is each version of a file is about 400 to 600 bytes of database space. Each cache or storage pool copy of a file is about 100 to 200 bytes of database space. By default, caching is turned off. Here's our estimation scenario. In this scenario, we have 50 million backup objects. We're going to retain 3 copies, so 150 million stored backed up objects. For archive, 10 million. For space management, which we're not going into in this class, this is our HSM, would have 20 million objects migrated from client workstations. Doing the math, we have our 50 million times 3 for backed up objects, plus 10 million for archived objects, and 20 million for space managed objects, times 600 bytes per object, 100 gigabytes. For copy storage pools, we're going to use our 150 million plus 10 million plus 20 million for our backup, archive, and space managed objects, saying that there will be a copy for each, so times 200 bytes is another 34.3 gigabytes. And because we want to have an active data pool with the active copy, that would be 50 million versions, this is our 50 million here, times 200 bytes is another 9.5 gigabytes. So we have 144 gigabytes, plus let's add in some overhead, so approximately 216 gigabytes for this scenario. Now this is based on what you currently have. It's not taking into consideration your growth. So you would want to add more. And here's caching. Remember, caching takes up additional database space if you're using it. Caching is a way of keeping a copy in cache as opposed to having to go to your storage pools. Something you could do is use active data pools instead. Now, if you need to increase your database, it's very simple. You provide an additional space, empty directory or drive owned by the TSM instance owner, then use the extend db space command to extend into that new space. Directories must be empty and owned by the ID of your TSM instance owner, which is your database manager. You can get more information from the IBM Tivoli Storage Manager Performance Manual. Increasing the log size. If you want to increase the active log size, you do so in your dsmserve.opt file. Remember when we did the query options and we saw all the options in the dsmserve.opt file? You saw that the active log in our lab scenario was at 2 gigabytes. So by editing dsmserve.opt, you can increase the active log size. Now the maximum size is 128 gigs. Here's a tip. Don't go beyond 120 gigs. This way you have 8 gigs in which you can then recreate another server instance, because the maximum active log size is 128. So when you're getting close to 120, you can then bump it up to 128, but know that you need to probably create another server instance at this time. You can change the location. Like we showed you in the dsmserve.opt file, you just specify a new location. Again, if you change locations, you must have empty directories owned by the TSM instance owner ID. You can also use your administration center to look at your database and recovery log size. Under Manage Servers, click the name of your server and select Database and Log in the Server Properties page. You can also add space here. In the Select Action menu, you can add a directory as long as you have a directory that is empty and owned by the TSM Instance Owner ID, which is also the Database Manager ID.